here to speak. So I'm going to just upload my slides. So for the first hour, when I do this, I will lose you all, so I won't see you or the chat. So for the first hour, I'm going to be doing kind of a webinar and covering psychologically safe management. And then for the second hour, we'll have time to have an open discussion and questions. And it'd be really interesting to hear what your organisations are doing and what they're doing well and perhaps not so well, and share those ideas with each other. So thank you. And so this is a really important topic, and I think more now than perhaps before, because so many staff are working remotely, we're working over so many different time zones, and we're all more activated in our stress response because we're living and working through a pandemic. So it's worth keeping that in mind as we go through. Sorry, I'm just going to get used to, that's it, changing the slides. Okay, so I've broken this down into 3 sections. So I'm going to start off just by introducing myself. Who are FD consultants? There's a couple of associates here today joining us, so it's lovely to see familiar faces. And then what does psychologically safe mean? And what is psychologically safe management? And Christoph, you kind of highlighted a really important point, that there's I think 90% female or more on this call. It'd be interesting to know from previous webinars whether that was similar or whether that's particularly about this topic. And then we're going to be looking at management skills, so the authentic leader, models of leadership, role modelling good self-care and promoting well-being in the workplace. And then the organisational culture, so becoming a psychologically well-informed environment, challenging stigma, and holding the well-being of people at its heart. That's really the main message that's going to come through today. So a little bit about FD Consultants and who we are, and myself. So we're a global psychological health consultancy. We're a network of over 50 trauma specialist associates. We live and work globally. We speak over 20 languages. And the reason we support organisations and individuals who are impacted by stress, burnout, anxiety, trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm sure most of you have heard of the term PTSD if you were listening in on the previous trauma webinar. So I set up FD Consultants because in a way I was becoming more and more frustrated with the quality of care for staff in organisations. And, you know, if I was going out presenting on stress management and resilience building and then noticing that my colleagues are going off work with burnout, it just started to feel very hypocritical. So I wanted to set up something that really was offering best practice care, that was accessible globally, was a high quality evidence-based care for staff. And we want to take care of the carers. How do we help you stay resilient in the work that you do so that you can continue to do that great work? And why is that often overlooked, particularly in this sector? So if we look at this slide, we specialise in the humanitarian sector. Most of our client organisations are from the human rights and humanitarian sector. We also work with mental health charities, and emergency first responders such as the police, firefighters, ambulance service and prison services. And then more recently, journalists and media, artificial intelligence and counter-terrorist groups have reached out to us. And this is because of the recognition around vicarious trauma. And what I mean by vicarious trauma, sometimes referred to as secondary traumatization, is how we can be impacted vicariously. So by listening to stories of trauma, we may not be on the front line, but we might be fundraisers, we might be researchers, we might be in the comms or social media, and we're going to be exposed to traumatic material. So there's a lot of research now to show that we can be impacted vicariously from trauma. So these organisations are reaching out because they're doing a lot of online work, trawling through social media to find certain things that they need to look for their research. And there's a big high profile case some of you may be aware of from Facebook, where some of their employees sued them for suffering post-traumatic stress disorder due to this vicarious trauma of being exposed to traumatic material online. So it's kind of, people are becoming much more aware of it. When we first started out, FD Consultants, most of our work was crisis response, supporting organisations through critical incidents. And we're an advocate for preventative work. And we've been chipping away at that. And actually last year particularly, I would say organisations are reaching out more for preventative services. But this is because of COVID. And actually, if you think about it, COVID is a crisis response. It's a trauma. This isn't a stress instance. This is traumatic. People are living or dying, you know, it has that impact. And so organisations have reached out a lot more for our training programmes, and in this slide you can see. So stress management and resilience building, that tends to be a programme we offer to all staff. That's a half-day programme. Also trauma awareness, this trauma awareness, vicarious trauma for those staff that are identified in high-risk roles. Mental health awareness, particularly for managers, how to support their staff with mental health needs. So giving them that psychological information so they can be psychologically informed. Also, due to COVID, we've been training on crisis response, and that's particularly for the leadership team, that if someone was to die of COVID, how would they support colleagues and family? And how well do organisations do this if a member of staff dies on the job as well? Communicated threat is another workshop we do because of the increase of this online exposure to trauma. Family liaison in a crisis, and mindfulness. Actually, I was doing a short webinar this afternoon on some mindfulness, which is always quite nice to do. Additionally, we've had coverage on Good Morning Britain, BBC World News, Victoria Derbyshire, and Radio Live 5. And our associates are all accredited therapists, country dependent, and have over 10 years of experience. So we offer the trauma specialist services, so critical incident management, psychological debriefs, peer support programs, trauma assessments, and also because we are trauma specialists, we are trained in EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, and trauma-focused CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. These are the two trauma approaches that are recommended by WHO, APA, and the NICE guidelines. And actually being trained in EMDR, we are finding we are getting really excellent results in people recovering from PTSD very quickly. And so someone who possibly could see a therapist in talking therapy, what they might achieve in 2 years, we may be able to support them over 6 to 12 weeks with the EMDR therapy. So it makes a really big difference to someone's recovery. So a little bit about me. I suffered post-traumatic stress disorder. I share that story in my book. So thank you, Christophe, for mentioning the book. We are trying to get translations into French and Arabic now, so I will keep you posted if that happens. So I suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder in my early 20s. So this was over 30 years ago, when there was very little understanding of what good quality care, trauma care was. And I came to London and I started working in advertising initially, and then decided to retrain as a psychotherapist. So I was supporting people in the criminal system through victim support as a volunteer through that time anyway, and then retrained as a psychotherapist. And since then I specialised in trauma. I've been working in this field now for over 15 years. I started working in the National Health Service in London and was working in forensic sexual assault. And so I was working alongside medical staff and the Metropolitan Police. And what I experienced was a lot of medical staff who were suffering burnout. They were so passionate about what they were doing, but they were absolutely exhausted. And I also witnessed a lot of police officers who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And this became a theme really through my career, because then I joined Transport for London and was the lead counsellor on their trauma and counselling service. And I joined just after the 7/7 terrorist attack. So I was very much thrown in the deep end of crisis response. And I was managing a team of counsellors that had done such an amazing job of looking after the staff and supporting them and getting them well and getting them back to work. But who was looking after them? And they were suffering from vicarious trauma and burnout. And within a year, that team, probably most of that team changed. So again, this was this theme: who's looking after the people that want to do these types of roles? I then joined InterHealth Worldwide, where we supported over 500 NGOs, mission organisations and government organisations. And they went into liquidation in 2017. Some of you may be familiar with them. And from that, I mean, actually before that happened, I was already thinking about setting up FD Consultants, because I wanted to set up a trauma specialist service, a network of associates, and offer that global support and guidance to organisations in staff, best practice support for staff. So I've published 2 books, as Christoph mentioned: Psychosocial Support for Humanitarian Aid Workers. This was, Rutledge actually reached out to me and asked me to write this book, and there's lots and lots of references, and you'll get copies of these slides, so you'll be able to do further reading. And really, it's a book that would support anyone whose work exposes them to trauma. But it's specifically for the humanitarian sector. And I think that's really important, because there's very little written actually to support in regards to psychosocial support for humanitarian aid workers. So it's filled with case studies, personal case studies of people that work in the field and how they've recovered. And Christoph is one of those case studies in the book. And then this year, I also wrote another book. I've just literally published this book, Molly and the Two Pigeons. And this was actually something I wrote to support my own well-being through lockdown. And what we know with trauma therapy is that imagination is very powerful and can help our recovery. And actually, I found that if I could lose myself in my imagination, but also learn about coronavirus at the same time, then I could learn about it in a way that wasn't activating my stress cycle. So this is about a story of animals that go on an adventure to find a cure for the coronavirus and help the people. And it's actually my puppy, Molly, in the middle of that. But so I'm hoping it goes some way to helping young people, children learn about coronavirus, but in a fun and light-hearted way, and support their mental health. And all the proceeds of that go to the National Health Service and those impacted by coronavirus. So I've presented on television, radio, and several international conferences on best practice organisational psychosocial support. I've personally experienced compassion fatigue and burnout within the workplace. I've been made redundant twice. And how these events are managed by organisations and managers makes a huge impact on someone's recovery. So my passion is to make sure that people do get the best practice support and a timely support, which we will go on to discuss. So why do we need psychologically safe management, and what is it? So let's just look at the why. So 1 in 4 adults experience at least one diagnosable mental health problem in any given year. That research is taken from Mind, but who also come up with similar statistics, because they feel that globally this is underreported anyway. 30% of staff report significant symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and an increased level of depression and anxiety. What does that actually mean? So if you look at the general population, it's about 5% of people suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. So 30% is really high. It's equivalent to emergency first responders. It's equivalent to a group of people that may have experienced firsthand a terrorist attack. So this is high numbers. And needs to be taken seriously. In the research for the book, we found that 85% of staff felt stigma was still an issue when asking for psychological support. So they're not able to speak out and feel that they're going to get supported. And only 20% of staff felt that their organisation offered sufficient psychosocial support. So that's 80% of staff don't feel their organisation offers sufficient support, and there's stigma. So that's going to make it really difficult for people to reach out and ask for support when they need it, which makes it even more important that managers can spot those signs and put those resources in place for their staff. So the other research that came out of our book, and also the hundreds and hundreds of workshops that we've facilitated. So what are the stress and trauma factors specific to the sector? So high workloads or poor working conditions, so excessive hours. There's this always on culture because of technology, and this is increasing. The pressures of this are increasing, and particularly because of COVID and working remotely, it's really hard to have that work-life balance and where to switch off and switch off from work. So working over time zones, sometimes working in isolation. And again, this is something that's really important for individuals and managers to watch out for. Staff that are becoming disconnected or isolated. How do we keep connected? It's really important during this time that we stay connected. So, and then the unreasonable deadlines. So this creates a much more reactive organization than a responsive organization. And that means that there's not much time for planning and preparation, and there's not much time for kind of reflective learning afterwards either. So that, it's often jumping from one major task to another. The risk of exposure to traumatic material, so whether that's directly or indirectly impacted by trauma, and the impact that that has. Lack of support, so what's available, where's the flexibility, is there support for childcare, what sort of training, what psychological support, how do we embed that into an organisation so that it becomes normalised, and it's part of what's available, rather than people feeling that they're going to be put in the spotlight if they ask for that support. Difficult relationships. Well, if we've got a more reactive organisation, a more stressed organisation, it leads to breakdown of communication, which then can lead to splitting and ruptures and bullying. Organisational change seems to be a common theme that happens, every few years. It seems that a lot of these organisations are going through organisational change. This really changes it doesn't make people feel safe. It makes people feel very insecure. And how that's managed is really important. And then all of this right now is compounded by the fact that we're living and working through a pandemic. So the challenges of working from home, juggling home life, whether we're having to homeschool or whether we live on our own and we're feeling isolated. The saturation levels, I'll talk about that quite a bit. So knowing where our saturation level is, it's really important for our own mental health, to know when we need to switch off and to really listen to our bodies, because our bodies will tell us this information, but our mind often overrules it and says, no, you've got to keep going. Restriction of movement because of the pandemic. So, and that's having a big impact on our mental health, the risk on our health, and the lack of access to our usual resources. So all of this is going to compound our stress and our trauma, and how do we look after the staff knowing this is happening. So what type of incidents also that we've been managing at FD Consultants? So these are the critical incidents we've been managing over the last 3 years. And here you can see that actually sexual violence is the largest number of incidents that we've been managing. And there are lots of changes being made in the organisation due to high profile cases. You can often see adverts for safeguarding leads in different organisations now, and they're building up these departments. But I still think there's a long way to go, and lots of individuals that we're supporting are being re-traumatised through this process, through the investigation process, or the lack of support. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Death of a member of staff, so I mentioned that we're running out some trainings for leadership team, and this includes staff that take their own life. And actually last year, often around the end of the year, we see numbers increase, and we were supporting 4 different organisations of members of staff that took their own life, and sometimes within the workplace. So have they got guidelines in place for managers in how to support someone if they're having suicidal ideation? Is that part of their critical incident plan? It's often not even mentioned, and it's really important because it does happen. Civil unrest, assault, transport accidents, terrorist attacks, pandemics. We've been supporting individuals from Ebola right through to coronavirus, and natural disasters. And then is in the book, that we found over 3 years of collecting data. Again, sexual violence increased by 25%, and severe mental health issues increased by 21%. So it's so important that managers understand and know the signs to look out for to live. The quote I always like to refer to is by Porges. He's a trauma specialist therapist, done a lot of research and written a lot of books on trauma. If you want to improve the world, start by making people feel safer. And I think that really says it all to me, because if we don't feel safe, we're going to be much more reactive. We're going to be much more emotional when we feel threatened. Our stress response is going to be heightened. It makes it harder for us to learn, develop, and grow, because that neocortex part of the brain goes offline. Our thinking, rational part of the brain goes offline when we feel under threat. Which is happening now also with coronavirus, and possibly even when we watch the news, we get activated. So this creates defensiveness, exclusion, and division. And in psychological terms, we refer to this division as splitting. And I see this, when I go and support new organizations, I can usually feel how stressed an organization is, one, through the terminology, the type of language they're using, but also this splitting. We see this splitting happening when an organization's under high levels of stress. So, and then the language might be, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. This kind of splitting between senior management and management, or staff and management, or even within teams. So that's something to watch out for around a highly stressed organization. And this is going to break down trust, possibly lead to unequal treatment, scapegoating, and a bullying culture. So a person-centered organization has people at its heart, both people it serves and people it employs. So I'm an integrative therapist, and that means I'm trained in lots of different approaches. And at the core of the humanistic approach is the person-centered approach. And this, to me, aligns with the humanitarian set of values of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. So we place people at the heart of our decision-making. And we give people a voice. We listen to what they want, because it's going to be different things for different people. Even if they're suffering from the same thing, they will want different support. In the flyer for this particular webinar, I think we quoted Richard Branson. So he says, people are our greatest asset. Clients do not come first, employees come first. And according to Google, the secret behind high-performing teams is psychological safety. So when I started working in the charity and the humanitarian sector, I was really shocked at how little support there was, how little psychological safety there was for staff, how little recognition of the type of work and the exposure and the impact that's going to have. And I've worked in the public and private sector, so I was quite surprised by that. And then I looked up, just as I was doing some preparation for this webinar, I looked at some of the big humanitarian sector organizations. I looked at their websites, and they have these statements across the first page: create a fair world for everyone, stand up for humanity and human rights. We work with the world's most vulnerable people to transform their lives. So why are these commitments not being offered to the well-being of their own staff? And a theme that came out from the book, actually, and the questionnaires and the conversations and interviews I had with individuals, was that we often overlook our own self-care for the greater cause. Within this type of work, and any kind of caring work, therapists, emergency first responders, humanitarian aid workers, we often overlook our own self-care for the greater cause. And then that can be taken advantage of by organizations. And lots of individuals have said, this is more than a job, this is my life purpose. And the work can also be addictive. It's quite adrenaline fueled, and we can feel indispensable, and therefore it becomes quite hard to know when to stop. And the work is endless. We want to change the world for the better, so that we can feel helpless in that. That might lead us to work really long hours. And then boundaries. So that obviously then will impact our healthy work-life boundaries. And one manager said to me recently, I manage my staff's enthusiasm. And I thought that was quite an interesting statement, and hadn't heard that very much, but it kind of made sense, actually. And we can talk about that maybe a bit more. And another book in the references that I refer to is actually, it's often the most conscientious, hardworking staff that suffer from burnout, vicarious trauma, stress, anxiety. And this really challenges stigma and turns it on its head. And this doctor wrote a book called Depressive Illness, The Curse of the Strong by Tim Cantifer. It's in the references. And I think that title says it all, actually. It's often those that give too much of themselves, don't know when to stop. And actually, those are the signs perhaps that managers should be watching out for in creating those healthy work-life boundaries and a containment for that. I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Okay, there we are. Sorry. Okay, so this slide shows a picture of 3 people who have told their story publicly. So Mary Colvin is one of the world's most celebrated war correspondents, and she suffered severe PTSD. Her story is told in Vanity Fair and in the film A Private War. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend watching it. And her focus was to give a voice to the voiceless. But actually, who was listening to her? Who spotted the signs that she was suffering from PTSD and her mental health was deteriorating? She was encouraged to take more and more risk. And what we know is that if you're moving towards burnout and PTSD, it's actually quite hard to make those decisions for yourself. Other people will see it around you. And you need someone supportive to guide you through that. So she was taking more and more risk. And eventually she died whilst on the job in Syria. So I just made some notes. I'm not sure what I meant by that. And oh yes, I know what it was. So when I was working at Transport for London and we were managing the terrorist attack, and there was this guy was telling me his story. So he was an emergency first responder, and he had been working 3 days flat out without stopping. And his manager said to him, you need to go back to the hotel now and go and have a rest. And he got very angry. He was like, no, these people need me. I'm fine. I can carry on. He was fueled with that adrenaline. And she said, no, you really have to go back to the hotel. I'm telling you, you have to go back to the hotel. And when he got back to the hotel, he burst into tears. And at that point is when he felt the full force of the experience. So we can get on this treadmill where it's hard to come off and stop, and it's addictive. And sometimes people choose to run from one high risk deployment to the next because they're actually scared that when they stop, that's when they're going to feel that full force. So we've also got Kat Carter here. She works for Save the Children UK, and she gave a TED talk. And again, if you haven't seen it, I would recommend you can Google Kat Carter and TED talk. And she talks about her experience of vicarious trauma. And she said she suffered for 5 years before she reached out and asked for help. And it was guilt that prevented her from saying, I'm suffering. So it was guilt because how can I say that I'm suffering when all these terrible things are happening, much worse things are happening to people around the world? Who am I to say I'm suffering? But what happened then is that her vicarious trauma turned to post-traumatic stress disorder and became much more complex. And that's what can happen. Stress can turn into burnout. Things can become much more complex and much more serious. So she talks about having EMDR therapy, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, and how she went on that journey of recovery. But again, who was watching out for her in those 5 years? Who was spotting those signs and trying to support her? And then the third story we have here is Fergal Keane. He's again a reporter for the BBC, foreign news reporter, and he publicly says, I had to leave my job because of post-traumatic stress disorder. And some jobs do have a shelf life, or we have to make these difficult decisions to leave a job that we love because of the impact it's had on our mental health. And there's many stories of this in the book. It's full of case studies where employers did not recognize the signs of someone's mental health deteriorating, have the right measures in place to signpost people to professional support, and didn't follow the policies and procedures which further re-traumatized individuals. So how can we prevent this from happening? So managers, we need to become psychologically informed. We need to recognise the mental health warning signs and support staff. So psychological safety is being able to show and employ oneself without fear of negative consequences. of self-image, status, or career. It can be defined as a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. In psychological safe teams, team members feel accepted and respected. Studies on psychological safety point to wide-ranging benefits, including increased confidence, creativity, trust, and productivity. So in a psychologically safe environment, creativity, productivity, and innovation can thrive. Speaking out will not lead to punishment or embarrassment. You'll be able to admit and learn from mistakes. You'll be able to speak out more openly about work-related issues. And you may feel able to ask for support when you're struggling, when your mental health is struggling. And one report found that it makes employees more engaged in their work and can lead to a 12% increase in productivity. So when employees have reason to fear vulnerability, issues in the workplace don't get talked about. Instead, they go under the radar or they become misdiagnosed. And I'm sure we've all worked in teams where no one talks about the elephant in the room. I don't know if you all know that impression, but it's like everyone knows there's something that's not being talked about. And unfortunately, when things aren't spoken about, they tend to fester and escalate. They don't go away, and they can become much more serious. So it's important that we have a space to talk about these things. So for example, bullying, sexual exploitation. I had a client who was going on her first deployment, and when she arrived she was told to, oh, let's not, there was some sexual exploitation going on within this organization, and she was told that these things just happen, turn a blind eye to it. Now we need to really listen to those messages, because that's so toxic and so destructive, and those messages are very powerful. So it creates an environment where it's harder to learn, because that neocortex, when we're feeling under threat, our neocortex goes offline. That's our rational thinking part, our memory, our concentration. And that happens sometimes, getting the balance right with those heat trainings. Some are more exposing than others to traumatic materials and getting you activated. Some trainings will drag you out of bed in the middle of the night and put a bag over your head. Others are much more psychologically sensitive. And people have been re-triggered on some of those trainings. If they have unprocessed traumas in their past, they may come up to the surface. And actually, if we're activated to that level of stress, we can't learn. So we need to get that balance right. And then, so watching out for that erosive, toxic terminology within organizations. So I remember when I was promoted to manager and I looked at my diary and I had these 5 to 5 back-to-back meetings, and there was no lunch break. And the CEO walked past my desk and I said, look, I've got these 5 meetings back-to-back, no lunch break. And her comment to me in front of the whole office was, welcome to my world. So watch out for these really erosive, really toxic statements. When you get a new member of staff and they're enthusiastic and they come with all this energy and they share these ideas, and then they're just told, oh, we've tried that before, it doesn't work. It's so demotivating. But this is what happens, that kind of splitting the right and wrong. If we're using terminology like the good guys, the bad guys, they're right, we're wrong, whatever it is. I heard someone say information is power, so they weren't willing to share information. The word scapegoat, or they're troublemakers, these are all signs to say that this organization is not psychologically safe. Another statement I heard was when a CEO kept giving a speech about we need to give 110%. I don't think that's a healthy thing to say, personally. And actually, if we're giving 60% right now through a pandemic, I think we're doing damn well. And so it's kind of watching out for that very erosive terminology in a culture. So what is psychologically safe management? A team is not a group of people who work together. A team is a group of people who trust each other. It's about building trust. And actually, there was a really interesting research by Deloitte about stress in the workplace. And then what it showed is that actually trust between management and staff has been breaking down more and more over the last few years. So how do we build that back up? And it's the leader that sets the tone of the organizational culture. Now, this puts a lot of pressure on us as managers and leaders, but it's really important that we role model what is good self-care, and we want to be psychologically informed. You know, stress is contagious. If we have a stressed manager, this causes a ripple effect throughout the organization and down through the team. So in a safe environment, the organization will protect its people. In an unsafe organization, we need to protect ourselves from each other. And we know that that's not going to be productive. Okay, so here I relate to Simon Sinek, who was also quoted, I think, in the flyer for the webinar today. So he's given a lot of talks on leadership and written a lot of books about leadership. And he talks about Apple, Martin Luther King, and the Wright brothers, and asks why are they so successful or inspiring. And he concludes that they think, act, and communicate in the same way, which is often different from many of other organizations. So he talks about this golden circle communication. And what he says is most organizations communicate from the outside in. So what do we do? How do we do it? And you might get a bit of why, what we believe in, sometimes not. So he says that organizations and leaders that inspire more than anyone else communicate inside out thinking. So they start with the why, and then the how, and then the what. So we follow those who lead because we want to, not because we have to. And they have the they have the ability to inspire people. So as Martin Luther King's speech starts with, I had a dream, I believe. And why I like this model so much is because he then relates it to the three-part brain, which we often talk about in our stress workshops or in our trauma awareness workshops. And this is very, very simplistic. And sometimes we'll draw these three circles and we'll talk about the central part of the brain is our reptilian brain. It's about survival. It's eating, breathing, sleeping, temperature. We can't live without it. Then the second layer of the brain is the limbic brain. It's about our emotional response. And then the outer cortex, the near prefrontal cortex, is our analytical thinking language center. So what he's actually saying here is if we talk from our passion, from our emotion, from the core of our being, that's when we're going to be inspiring people. And so that also links to vulnerability, sharing our vulnerability, sharing our struggles and how we've come through those. And actually, if you read anything about leadership over the last few years, vulnerability comes up over and over again. How do we share vulnerability as leaders and do that well? And we also talk about bottom up and top down. So he talks about inside out communicating, and I'll say a bit more about that. But we have a vagus nerve that sends messages up to our brain, and it's often called upstreaming. So information is coming from bottom up. And actually top down, bottom up, I talk about that in stress management workshops as well, because we all have a responsibility in an organization to change the culture, every single one of us. So, you know, because sometimes when I do stress management workshops for staff, they say, why are we on this? The managers should be on this workshop. They're the ones that are causing the problems. But we all have a responsibility to change an organizational culture. And so he talks about gut intuition, because this is coming from our gut intuition, from the reptilian and the limbic. It's our gut intuition. And when we just know something's right or something doesn't feel right. And what listening to our intuition does is it helps us avoid unhealthy relationships. But what prevents us from listening to our gut feeling is overthinking. So this neocortex part of the brain, that could be our prejudices, unconscious biases, other people's opinions, the shoulds, that can dampen down our intuition. And what actually helps is reflection, pause moments, taking deep breaths that connect us to our intuition. So again, it could be linked to mindfulness and those kinds of practices. And then what I found quite interesting when I was doing this research, I came across this research on financial traders, and it was saying they were really good at risky decision making. And that there were two reasons for that, because they hold grace under pressure and they trust their gut intuition. So we can do that. We can trust our gut and activate grace under pressure by deep breathing. So anytime we feel anxious, and one of the most simplest exercises I say is make your out breath longer than your in breath. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system, it calms our system. Making the out breath longer than the in breath activates the vagus nerve and calms our system down. So therefore, to have a psychologically safe environment, we need to create space for reflection and learning. We need to develop psychologically informed managers, and we need to connect with each other from our core, the inside out thinking. So I also relate this to the person-centered approach, as I mentioned earlier. So, we start with the individual, then to the team, and then to the organization. And this is quite a nice way of looking at it with these three rings, because in a way, the organization needs to hold the container around the individual and the team. And so person-centered organizations, they're less hierarchical, they work collaboratively, they do not breed micromanagement. People feel their opinion counts and they're listened to, and they feel validated. Bottom-up communication involves the inclusion of all employees, their ideas and perceptions. People are given autonomy and are able to make mistakes and learn from them. They feel able to make mistakes and learn from them. And again, I found this interesting because with trauma therapy, we often talk about bottom up when we're relating to neuroscience. So we enable people to listen to their gut feeling, and we offer them stabilization and resources and normalization. And we're going to do all of that first before we do any form of processing therapy. We know you can't expect someone to process their trauma experiences without feeling grounded and safe first, because actually that will cause more harm and can re-traumatize people. So another model, well, what are the components of psychological safety? So this is from Psychological Safety Works, and they talk about these 6 components. So courage, openness, flexibility, resilience, engagement, learning. I'm just going to skim through a couple of models, but if you want to do more reading, their references, you'll be supplied with all the references. So obviously courage is about speaking up, taking risk, taking accountability. The power of an apology is huge. But lots of organizations, when there's been a major incident, they'll go into deny, distort, avoid. And actually what happens then is things will escalate. It will become much worse. So I'm often advising leaders to apologize. And when I've seen that done and done well, it makes so much difference. Openness, so open communication, being open to giving and receiving feedback. Allow space to have the uncomfortable conversations, identify the splitting, include your team members in decision making, and explain the reasons behind decisions, especially at the moment through all the organizational change or through the pandemic. It's really important to keep people informed and what decisions are being made. So often courage and openness together equal vulnerability. And as I mentioned, if you read anything about leadership, it talks about vulnerability. And that doesn't mean necessarily showing all your emotion, but it's sharing that you're struggling. So I was working with a team recently where the manager shared how their own personal struggles of working through the pandemic. But what this did is it opened the door for others to talk about their own struggles. It created a space for those conversations. If a manager doesn't share that, people feel that they can't share those things too. So it's just, we're in this together. Let's share our struggles and open up those really important conversations. Flexibility. So of course, at the moment, things are changing constantly, work-wise and in our personal lives. And the 3 main characteristics for resilience are adaptability, so the ability to be flexible, acceptance of the reality, and then finding new meaning. So if we relate that to COVID, then we have to adapt to the situation. We have to take measures to stay safe. That's the things we do have control over. We have to accept this is the situation we're in for the time being. And we need to find new meaning, which often means appreciating the smaller things that perhaps we took for granted initially. And then resilience. This is often described as the ability to bounce back. And resilience is fluid, because some days we're going to feel highly resilient, full of energy, and other days we're not. If we're going through a relationship separation, or we're looking after someone who's unwell in the family, we're not going to be as resilient as we normally are. So it's fluid. And but it is about prioritizing and role modeling our own self-care and holding healthy boundaries, and focusing on what we can control rather than what we can't control. And that's really challenging at the moment. And then engagement. How do we build the morale? We want, understand your staff and what's going on for them. So this is about good listening skills. If your staff don't feel that you pay them attention, they'll shut down. And I've seen this happen in meetings. I've seen managers turn their back to the screen, shut their video off and not explain why. I mean, I understand when we're working from home, the doorbell might go, there's a parcel, or the dog might bark. We all understand that. But if you're really looking like you're not paying attention, that's going to have a huge impact on the staff and their motivation, and on them feeling psychologically safe. And then creating an environment where people can speak up. And then learning, so having that self-awareness. Daniel Coyle, I think his book Culture Code, he talks about asking this one question, which is, name one thing you would like me to stop doing and one thing you want me to continue to do. And just asking your staff that one question, he says, can make a really big difference. And we also, as managers, need to reach out for support, recognize the signs in ourselves, use the services that are available, because if we're going to signpost and recommend them, we need to know what it's like to have that experience. And there was this one organization where we ran stress management and resilience building workshops, and for about 3 years, and then we were going to roll out some management training. So we thought we'd look back to see how many managers had actually attended this course, and it was 2%. 2% of managers attended the course. So, we as managers, you need that support as well, and to have that opportunity for training. So this is another model. I just really liked the simplicity of this model, really. And this is by Deepak Chopra, and he uses the acronym of leaders. So look and listen, emotional bonding, awareness, doing, empowerment, responsibility, and synchronicity. So the listener is really asking those questions, wanting to know what's going on for your staff, and particularly now through COVID, what are their circumstances? Where are they living? Who are they living with? Have they had a member of the family who's been ill and been impacted? What I find over and over again is the most destructive thing in any organization is when people don't feel heard. It's so important to enable people. As human beings, we want to be seen and we want to feel that we're heard. And that's the greatest gift we can give to someone, really. And then that emotional bonding. So again, back to the golden circle of communication. So connecting from that core part of ourselves, and helping people reach their potential. And this creates loyalty and motivation. And he talks about avoiding the 3 A's, which I found quite interesting. So that's authority, anger, and aloofness. And then building awareness. So self-awareness can equal good leadership. How does our behavior impact others? Really understanding that. And then the doing, so follow things up. It's so important. If someone comes to you and they say they're struggling and they're struggling with stress, follow that up, manage things head on, because we know that things can escalate and become much more complex. And then the empowerment. So the belief in others, giving people opportunity. If we micromanage, we're not giving people an opportunity to grow and learn and make their own mistakes. And then R is for responsibility. So that's, again, the accountability, or I'm responsible for how I think, act, and feel. How many times have we heard someone say, well, I did that because you made me feel this way? Actually, we have a choice in how we respond to situations. And then the synchronicity, which is introduced by Carl Jung, and when things start to align. So this is Soul of Leadership, which is quite a nice book to read. So I'm just aware of the time, probably only about 10 more minutes. Oh yes, sorry, I skipped past that one. Okay, so here I've just brought in a couple of case studies, and these are things that we've seen happening in organisations at FD Consultants. So here, a team have experienced civil unrest. Threats have been made to their personal safety. They have to immediately evacuate their office, and one member of staff is injured. So I've created two different outcomes. So outcome A, the team were offered a psychological debrief as a group. From this debrief, two members of staff were identified as needing further support. They both went on to have an individual trauma assessment, and one individual from that went on to have 6 sessions of trauma specialist counselling. Scenario B is that nothing was done, nothing was offered. Two members of the team went off sick. One went off sick, long-term sick. Another member of the team became very angry at the organisation. Their performance dropped, and eventually they left. So you can see that it can have such a huge impact on the outcome of how someone is supported. And I think particularly with trauma and that immediate support after an incident. Often when someone comes for trauma therapy, we find that actually it's not the incident they're working through, it's how they were treated immediately afterwards by everyone else around them, or something a manager said that's the thing that gets stuck. And actually, even with those two scenarios, what I'm trying to show there is which of these two scenarios cost more to an organisation. Because I hear over and over again, well, it's down to lack of resource. We don't have the money. We can't bring in these psychological services. But actually, the fallout of not having had that, of people leaving with experience or becoming angry at the organisation, and then that, it's in a way, it's a small world, and their reputation is talked about, and people go off sick, and that has a big impact on everybody. So in case study B, a member of the team who is usually a high performer comes to tell you that they're feeling stressed. So the outcome, there are two outcomes. So the team member was offered some reasonable adjustments at work. The manager discussed their specific needs. The team member went on to participate in a stress management course, and their performance started to improve over time. The second outcome is the team member was offered a short weekly checkup with their manager. Sometimes these were cancelled and sometimes at the last minute, and the manager often seemed distracted. The individual had mental health issues in their past, which were triggered through the lack of support from the organisation. And eventually the team member signed off sick and attempted suicide. So these are kind of common scenarios that we hear in the work that we do. And again, the question is, which scenario is more disruptive to the team and the organisation? Because that has a huge impact on the team. If people go off sick, if somebody leaves, if someone's burnt out, it has such a huge impact on the team. And so I think these are really important questions. And then this is some of the recommendations that we would make for organisations to have in place to support their staff. So we talk about preventative measures, treatment measures, and rehabilitation, so the organisational culture. And so we offer our training. We recommend, in an ideal world, that our training is in a stepped approach. We're doing some stepped training for a particular organisation at the moment, which starts with managers focusing on their personal resilience. Then it builds into mental health awareness for staff. So then in the skills about how to support staff, and then the management skill training, absence management, conflict resolution, and all of those things. But we start with the individual first and how they look after themselves first. So wellbeing is at the heart of the organisation. Peer support programs, regular screening, pre, mid and post deployment assessments. And then what we found last year, again, increase of the workshops, but also increase of supervision. So organisations are asking us to to offer a regular supervision, say monthly or every 2 months, to teams that are recommended, who are identified in high-risk roles. So that's usually teams that are exposed to trauma indirectly that we're supporting. So they have somewhere to go and kind of debrief or discuss that and get that support from their team members as well. And then treatment, so creating the wellbeing program, the trauma management program. Most organizations have an employment assistant program, but also checking that this is trauma specialist, because a lot of EAPs, even though they say they work with trauma, they're not trauma specialist services. And then the rehabilitation. So review and embed policies and procedures. If these kind of programs are embedded in a culture in the organization, it kind of normalizes. So people don't have to reach out. It's, you know, if we have regular screening, like with the Ebola, we saw that so many people came back with trauma or high levels of anxiety, but weren't putting themselves forward for a post assessment, and because they didn't want to be seen as being singled out. So actually one organization changed it to become an opt-out rather than an opt-in, and then it normalizes because everyone's doing it, and that helps to create that psychological safety. And then, so evaluate recruitment processes as well. Follow up. I've written no tick box exercises. I got so frustrated with this when I was working in Health, how we'd be called in to do these huge pieces of work and get their staff to talk about what's going on for them, and we'd make recommendations and then nothing would happen. That's the worst thing that an organisation can do, because people have really taken courage and risk to talk about how they're really impacted at work, and opened up, and then nothing happens. So things have to be followed up, and then role model those values. You know, those big bold statements across the websites, role model those values towards your staff. Practice what you preach. I think I've done a red line across my slides. I just realized that. That's funny. And then the critical incident plan. So again, checking, know your policies as well. So one of the things we do on the management training is to make sure that the managers read through certain policies before the training, and then we'll ask them about it. And there was a particular stress management policy, and at the end of it was a stress risk assessment for staff, and so many managers didn't even know it was there to use. So what's in your critical incident plan? Does it support managers if a member of staff is feeling suicidal? What steps are in place? Because otherwise we're not protecting the manager. And then does it include the trauma management program, which I've mentioned some things here: immediate crisis management, screening, family liaison, things I've kind of already talked about. And that follow-up, because we also know that about 30% of people have a delayed response to trauma. So that could be a month later, it could be 6 months later, and it could be a year later. So actually we need to follow people up and check in with them when they've been through a major crisis. So what can we do right now? I want you to feel that there are things you can do right now, and it's not all just about going on training courses, because this is about feeling empowered as managers. So what we can do right now, and things that people are doing through the pandemic, is really having those regular check-ins, getting to know your team, getting to know their individual circumstances. Let's promote well-being. So lots of organizations now, they're booking in an hour meeting, but they're only taking 45 minutes. So they've blocked the diary for an hour, but they're allowing people to have that 15-minute breather space. We want to create those pause moments, those reflective moments where people can just stretch and deep breathe or go for a walk. So shorter meetings, but keeping them blocked in, and also make all your meetings about task orientated. Well-being meetings, so things we can be talking about is sharing resources. How are you supporting yourself? How are you getting through this pandemic? How have you created your workstation? What's around your workstation at home? How do you create that divide between work-life balance? What are the things you're doing? Get everyone to share ideas. People are really creative, and it really helps a team to connect as well. One thing we're developing, and we've developed over the last year, are wellness action plans. So they're guide sheets for managers to have those conversations, so that we can start to identify what are the early warning signs for individuals. So what might trigger your stress? What might I need to look out for in you as an individual? What would you want me to do as a manager? You know, these kind of wellness action plans. Organizations are using those for all new staff, or they're using them when a staff is coming with a mental health crisis, or through COVID, organizations are using these every 6 months just through the pandemic to support staff. Greater use of flexible working. So one organisation was saying you can do your hours between 7 in the morning and 7 in the evening. As long as you do your 8 hours anywhere in there, we don't mind when you do them. So if you want to take a big chunk off in the middle of the day, you can do, because everyone's rhythm is different and everyone's responsibilities at home is different. So it's kind of being much more flexible. And actually from this, are people going to continue to work from home a few days a week? You know, which individuals would that suit, which individuals would that not suit, and getting to know that about your staff. Lower expectation and increased praise. Well, you know, right now we're all, our stress response is heightened, so managers need to lower expectation of themselves and of staff, and increase praise, because one thing we know when we're stressed is that our neuroscientists say we have a negative brain bias. So all these thoughts of I'm not good enough, I'm not coping, I'm a failure, and particularly if we're isolated and working from home and we don't have those conversations that we'd normally have in a corridor or in the kitchens, you know, that can fester. So we need validation, praise, acknowledgement in what we're doing. Know what psychological services are available and try them out for yourself as well, and, you know, and reach out for those services. Ensure people are taking leave and switch off. So if they're sending emails when they're on leave, you know, point that out to people. And you can actually you can schedule your emails so they don't have to go out of hours. I know it's difficult with different time zones, but we can do that, because I have had managers that say, well, I say to my staff, they don't need to read it outside of working hours, but that's the way I work and I'll send these emails anyway. But so many staff, if they know it's there, they'll look, they can't help themselves. It's how social media has been programmed, you know, Facebook, about the notifications. It makes you look, even though you don't want to. So think about that. And then train staff to pick up on the work of others. If someone does go off sick or if someone's on holiday, you know, there doesn't seem to be this backup that happens. Same for leadership team on the critical incident crisis management teams. You know, they don't have someone to back them up if they're not there, and that causes so much stress. Challenge stigma, so watch out for those toxic terminology, those statements that I mentioned, I gave a few examples of, or blaming culture, and obviously the role modeling good self-care. So risks to an organisation. Obviously, if we don't have a psychologically safe organisation, it can lead to reduction in productivity and increase in sickness levels. So this refers to Kat Carter's story, you know, catch those symptoms early so that people can be supported before they go off sick. Or if we don't recognise stress, it could turn into burnout. If someone goes off with stress, they might be off for a few days. If they go off work with burnout, they could be off for a month and they may never come back. High turnover rate of staff. So again, this relates to Fergal Keen's story, you know, where he felt he had to leave because of PTSD. So we want to stop recognise those signs and put supportive measures in place. And actually in the Deloitte survey research, it showed that every pound spent on wellbeing, there was a £5 return. So it's worth organisations investing in these services. And you know, what I struggle with sometimes is when there's lots of free services, because what happens, and this happens, therapists do it too, they jump in, they rescue, there's been a major crisis, let's go and offer free services. But what happens is that takes the responsibility away from the organisation. They need to prioritise and invest in their staff's well-being. Breakdown of communication. Firefighting, reactive versus responsive, so we become much more reactive. Poor decision making, because we haven't got the time to plan, prepare, and do that reflective learning. And then greater risk behaviour, so that's referring to Marie Covin's story, where she was taking greater and greater risk to the point where she died on the job. And security personnel would often say that's something they see when people are really stressed, that they start to take a lot more risk. So I'm just going to end on this quote. So we all have the capacity to inspire and empower others, but we must first be willing to devote ourselves to our personal growth and development as leaders. And how do we be kind to ourselves as well, look after ourselves, because it's a tough job in a tough sector. And this is our website, ftconsultants.net. There's lots and lots of resources that are supportive for managers as well. So how to manage the redundancy process, impact of staff, stress, burnout. There's a page on COVID. There's lots of mindfulness exercises you can listen into. And as I say, there's going to be lots of resources that I'll share with you on the slides. So I think that's probably enough of me talking. You probably heard enough of my voice for now. So I'm going to stop sharing. Before I do that, I just want you all to just tap the top of your head, because it's so important we change the energy. If we're tired, this can energize us. And get up and have a stretch just while I stop sharing this presentation, because every hour, if we move just a few minutes every hour, it will increase our productivity and our energy levels. So let's just do that, because 2 hours is a long time. And give yourself a stretch, grab yourself a drink. Great, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Fiona. That was a very interesting journey through a lot of different ideas and concepts and a lot of information. I very much enjoyed that, and I hope that everybody found something that is really relevant for them, or maybe it causes questions. So as we said in the beginning, we would like to have this more of an interactive discussion, if that's possible. We're not that many people today, so I think that should be possible. I would like to invite you, if you have a question or a statement even, or some reflection, or a good, what do you call it, a good example that you would like to share. Please speak up. You know, if it's possible, maybe turn on your video camera so we can see you. And maybe also, I think it would be nice if when you speak up, maybe just shortly introduce yourself. We can see your names, but maybe also tell us what is your role or where do you work, so we can put it a little bit into a context. So with this said, I think we have another 45 minutes so maximum, then we'll be here for 2 hours. I'd just like to open the round and you know, invite you to somebody to go ahead.
Sorry, if you doesn't feel if you doesn't like to speak, you can write on the chat and we can read the question.
Yes, by the way, that's another option. Thank you, Seb, for pointing that out. I mean, maybe I can just raise an issue here, because I noticed 3 points. One of them is that leaders set the tone of organizational culture. And the other one, you were talking about splitting. So, you know, a conflict between different parts within the organization, between staff and management, et cetera, et cetera. And then also you mentioned that 85% of the people fear the stigma for speaking out or asking for support. I mean, what kind of ideas would you suggest for really anyone, maybe a lower level manager or just a simple, you know, a not manager, a staff member, how could they, you know, safely engage in something that could be culture change, that could improve?
I mean, some organizations are implementing peer support programs. So they're training volunteers within the organisation on psychological first aid. So one, they're getting the knowledge, and two, they're, peers can be signposted to have that initial conversation in a safe way with a peer. So it wouldn't be with a manager, it'd be someone on the same level. And yeah, splitting. So what happens with splitting is that you have, you get these divides that happen. And I think the more unsafe we feel in an organization, we almost clump everyone into this group. Oh, that's the leadership team, they're the nasty guys. But actually they're made up of individuals. And so it's remembering to kind of identify everyone as individuals. Because otherwise it becomes very divisive. And any trauma incident, it brings people together or it creates divide. We see both happen. And we can see that in the pandemic as well, how that's bringing people together in the divide. I don't know if that answered your question, or if anyone has any ideas of what you do in your organizations that work well.
I was actually wondering if there's any organization or any example, where a peer support program has been set up successfully and one that's really operating and running well.
I do know some, but again, it's really because at the moment there's mental health first aid, I think, that's taking over, I think in the UK anyway, but it's very UK based, it's not global. And so we've kind of created our own version where it's much more addressing the global audience. So also it's how these peer support programs are implemented. So again, is it a tick box exercise? Is it just an organization saying we've trained these staff, but actually they have no system in place and people aren't being signposted and there's no kind of vetting of the service? And additional to that, like refresher training for the peer supporters and also supervision groups, so that if they're activated or triggered, they have somewhere to go. So I've seen in some organizations, they've sent people off for these trainings, and then there's been nothing else offered. So it has to be part of a system that's embedded into the organization for that to work well. Yeah, I agree. And but even having that training for staff, so they understand mental health themselves, they can recognize the signs in themselves and in their peers and in their colleagues, that's going to start changing an organizational culture because it's embedding it into the system. And people are going to be more psychologically informed and aware.
Maybe I could ask a different question. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on upwards management. And I think you've given a lot of really excellent reflections, thanks, around setting examples to our teams and management. I think quite a common position is that we're trying to lead by example, but of course there's the classic scenario that I think happens very frequently where we're trying to minimize sending emails outside of working hours, positive traits, etc. And then that pressure just comes from above, and you're trying to ensure you're not spreading it below, and it just kind of builds up in this kind of mid-management space. So I think I'd be really interested just to hear from other people and from you, Fiona, reflections around how, when we see our boss is struggling, and often particularly when that's in quite either hierarchical organizations or quite hierarchical cultures, where people aren't used to having these conversations. My work experience is in the Middle East and East Africa, and it's a very different conversation than in the UK, and how to go about flagging that concern to our boss in a way that's sensitive, and how we can do that, and yeah, any positive examples of kind of upwards management of stress where it's, yeah, be really interesting to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly, I'll be interested to hear other people's thoughts on this as well, and what other organisations are doing, but it's particularly difficult, I think, for mid-managers, because you are in that buffer role. So you have the pressure from above and the pressure from below, and it's really challenging. And that's why we are implementing these wellness action plans, because then everyone at every level is having those conversations. And so then someone would need to pick that up with your manager, and it wouldn't be your responsibility. But otherwise it's finding somebody who they would be willing to listen to have those conversations, because again, it's about self-awareness, isn't it? And we're doing this from a supportive measure to to help them, but it may not be seen that way sometimes. And it's interesting, when I do the pre-screenings, one of the things we ask is, you know, what do you notice about when you're stressed? What do you notice when you're stressed? And if someone says, oh no, I'm never stressed, that's a big warning sign to me, because everyone has a stress response and everyone gets stressed. And actually, usually people that say that, you can feel it in their body, it's full of tension, you can sense it, but they're like, no, I'm fine, it's nothing to do with me, I don't. So yeah, I can see that that's a challenge, but perhaps having these wellness action plans in place, or finding somebody who would who they would be willing to have that conversation with and feel comfortable with. But anyone else in their organisation where you feel this might have been done well?
I can chip in,
Yeah.
because I can give you an example of where it was done badly. And bad examples are usually very instructive. But this thing about upwards management is a very interesting one, but it needs to start at the recruitment phase. So when your manager is recruited, the people that someone from your level should be involved in the recruitment process, in my view. Now, we had an instance where none of us were involved for reasons that are too complicated to go into. And as a result, when we were introduced to the new boss, and immediately we went and Googled her, because it's the first thing you do, and we looked at the CV, and we were looking, I was like, why is this person being recruited? She didn't last out her probation period. So I would say that have the right people in the right positions. It sounds very easy, but that's where it starts for me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that is one of the areas mentioned in that organisation, or the rehabilitation part. But also, you know, because a lot of managers are promoted within the organisation. They don't get management training, they don't get support. And so actually, looking at their induction process, what training do they have, particularly around supporting staff mental health? One thing we're doing for organisations, we offer these coaching sessions, mental health coaching sessions for managers when they're supporting someone with severe mental health issues. And because they haven't had that training. And actually what we're finding in organizations is that managers are quite comfortable having conversations about someone who's off work with a physical ailment, but if it's mental health, they don't even want to have those conversations. And so how do we give managers confidence to have those conversations? Because they're just as important, and we have to ask the same questions as we would if it was someone's physical health, so that we can safeguard that individual, safeguard the manager, and safeguard the organization.
I would agree with you there. So I'm chipping in again, but I love this topic. But the point around confidence in management, to my mind, is not something that can be obtained by training. Confidence comes through experience. Management is something that you learn as you do it. Possibly almost more than anything else, but you have to live through these situations and live through meeting and managing various people to really understand how you yourself approach it and how to deal with these different situations. So I'm not against training, but for me, it's not really the answer. You need to recruit the right people for the right positions. And then one of the best courses I ever did at ICRC was a management training, but basically that was an excuse to get all middle managers together in Geneva. And all week we just talked about, oh, I have this guy over here who's a pain in the ass, oh, I have this problem. And all we did was effectively peer support, although we didn't know it. We were just ranting at each other about management issues.
Yes.
So that, I think, is super important, and ICRC has it embedded. I mean, unfortunately, these things are a bit expensive to do. So you don't find, I'm now no longer with ICRC, and I'm with another organization that doesn't have the funds to do that kind of stuff. But if you go and look for it, it depends on you also, kind of why why do people go into management? Some people are
Yeah.
kind of pushed there, some people choose it, some people don't choose it.
No, you're right. And I think peer support and peer, learning from peers within training is a crucial part of that training program. And yeah, I mean, some people are pushed into those roles when they don't actually want those roles. And that happens quite a lot, I think, in this sector as well.
So we have a question here in the chat. Over here, is there a program someone can recommend training trainers in PFA? And Lisa, thank you. You already gave an answer. ENSA.ch is the Swiss organization training on MHFA. But are there any others that you may be aware of, or anyone is aware of?
I know, I mean, we do it at FD Consultants, and I know there's the mental health first aid training as well. I'm not sure of any other.
I'm just wondering, is that something like standard, or what does a mental health first aid training actually involve?
So that you're training peers in supporting other peers. So we're recognizing the signs, the warning signs, what to look out for, how to have those supported conversations, but also being very boundaried around what is peer support and what is counselling. So we have that clear definition, knowing how to signpost and when to signpost.
What do you mean with signposting when you say signposting?
Oh, sorry, so onward referral. So what is available in the organisation, what is available for that particular individual's needs, and making sure they get the right support. So a lot, I don't know, I'd be interested with Lisa, I think you said you were training in the mental health first aid, but a lot of peer support programs would suggest that peer supporters offer a one support session and a one follow-up session. So they make that clear divide between counselling and peer support. But I don't know, Lisa, if that's the same on the mental health first aid.
Yeah, very much on the mental health first aid. It's about somebody being available to have that conversation with. So it's a very generic conversation. So as Fiona was saying earlier, if we can identify it much earlier, the stress before it becomes burnout, so having these casual conversations really helps. And then the mental health first aider in the organisation feels then the person needs further assistance than they can provide, it's the onward referral or signposting to the services that are around. So it might be like consider the EAP or consider the GP, or signposting if they think that that is needed. So it's trying to catch it really early. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, another way that organisations are trying to do this as well is to have kind of regular yearly screening for anyone that might be identified in a high risk role. So they'd have supportive conversations around that, so that again we can recognise the signs of deteriorating mental health early. Because what we know as therapists as well, if someone's coming to us and they've been struggling for a long time, it can become much more complex, because we can often turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms to try and manage our symptoms. And so we're then dealing with unpacking all of those before we actually can start to do the work. So, the sooner someone gets support, the better, and the quicker they're going to recover.
Chaba, you wanted to ask something?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Fiona. It's really, really interesting, your presentation. And I'm sorry to say I haven't read your book. I'd really like to. But I guess I'm just interested in when you wrote the book, and also kind of what you were presenting here in terms of demographics. And I mean, the obvious thing is here to distinguish between international staff and national staff, and staff from the global north and staff from the global south, just in terms of psychological safety and the issues that come up, because obviously it's different for different people, I imagine, what makes people safe, what the risk, what makes people feel that they're threatened in the workplace as much as sort of outside in the field and the critical incident or anything like that. So I'm just wondering how much that's explored in your book, as I say, not necessarily just national and international staff, but I think people of colour, when they're in a very white workspace as well, kind of, I think psychological safety is an issue there too. And yeah, just interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and there's a whole chapter in the book specifically on that because it's so important. And one thing we've done quite a lot at AFD Consultants is research on support for national staff and making sure that everyone has access, equal access to psychological support. And I think just a few weeks ago I was running a workshop in Armenia, so obviously they're dealing with conflict and top of COVID, and absolutely. So how are we supporting people in those types of environments? And one other thing that came up in, I think in that chapter, was around individual profiling as well. So lots of security will look at risk assessment in regards to the deployment or the environment that someone's working in, but actually what about the individual regarding their culture or their sexuality or their disability, and how is that individual then made to feel safe and protected? Yeah, so I mean we could have a whole other webinar on that subject alone.
Can I maybe ask a follow-up question to that? I'm Maria Wagner. I'm Integrity Officer at CoCreate, so I'm one of those safeguarding professionals you referred to earlier, and agree that there's still a long way to go. So my question relates to Gemma's actually on your experiences with regards to the barriers and also mitigations of creating safe, psychologically safe environments when it comes to speaking up about mental health issues, but also safeguarding issues. When we are looking at a sector and as a society where we have a lot of power imbalances, glass ceilings, concrete ceilings, etc. So I'm just wondering if you've explored that at all. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why a lot of organisations have brought in whistleblowing policies. They work well and maybe not so well, depending on who's managing those, you know. And actually, again, the follow-up and the action taken, lots of people feel that it goes nowhere. And in our trauma awareness training, we talk about fight, flight, freeze, but also fawn. And fawn is very much that threat response. So when we're talking particularly about high-profile sexual exploitation cases, yes, people may go into fight, flight, freeze, but fawn is more we're aware this is going on, but we're not saying anything. And that could be because of the power imbalances. And actually, what impact is that going to have on us if we speak out? And are we going to be scapegoated, or are we going to become the target of that unfavourable behaviour? Or are we going to lose our jobs? And if I lose my job, will I lose my home? So they're absolutely people, we think about that in talking about that response, because I think we can make judgment of that. And actually, it is a threat response. Those actions. So how do we make it possible for people that feel disempowered to find and have a voice? And sometimes that's also through, voice in teams. Or so one organisation where I worked for, there was some bullying between senior management and staff, and the person that spoke out against that became scapegoated. So then the team got together and signed something and put something forward. And we see that again with the Me Too campaign, you know, that we can empower, we can feel more empowered when we speak up as a group of people. And how do we create those situations?
There's another question here in the chat. Can mental health issues manifest themselves in physical symptoms?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So, I mean, that's a lot of what our training covers as well. And actually, it's why it's so hard to actually get clear statistics of how many people are off work with mental health issues, because they might be off with migraine, they might be off with back pain, they might be off with irritable bowel syndrome, stomach ulcers. There's so many things that are connected to stress. Because we're fueled with adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, and it causes a very powerful impact to the whole body, the whole of our body. I've even had people in my stress management courses that have ended up in emergency services thinking they're having a heart attack. That's how serious it can get physically. And they've had all the tests and they're told this is stress related. So I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that. I'm looking at the other therapists in the room.
Any other questions, statements?
Or what I have seen, just to answer to, or to add to what Fiona said, I would say that there are, in my practice, I always see physical reactions linked to trauma or stress. I would say it's a whole. You seldom see separated only, stress in your head without having physical symptoms with it. And I think we should see a package when we search for, if there is any event, you will see that maybe not immediately, but afterwards, depending on how people get help, there will be consequences. There will be consequences on the physical aspects.
Yeah, and I like that you say holistic, because it is. It's the physical, it's the psychological, it's a spiritual, it's how we make meaning of the world that can be hugely impacted by stress and anxiety and trauma. Yeah, so it impacts the whole system. And actually, that's why, for me, like working in emergency first responders, they get this training. It's part of their induction, so they will recognize those signs. And that's what I think humanitarian sector needs as well, just as a basic induction into this type of work. I've even heard people say, oh, well, we don't want to tell them that this awful thing is going to happen on this deployment because we don't want to frighten them off. That's not the approach. People need to be informed, and then they make an informed decision. And actually, if people are told, they can mentally prepare themselves. It's the worst impact is when we're not expecting something and it comes at us out the blue. And it would be much better if people were well informed before the experiences.
Can I ask you a question, Fiona? Because in your presentation, you are in your statistics on critical incidents. The first one was sexual violence. And I'm giving some trainings also for different organizations, Swiss government, on stress management and trauma awareness. And it's the first time that I see such a statistic. I'm always trying to give some also workshops on stress related to sexual safety for women or security for women in the field. And it's really a surprise to me to see it on the top of your list. So could you just add a few information about this? Because it's a taboo also in the organizations I've seen. I've been working earlier for 13 years for the ICRC, and it was not even addressed, but it was quite a long time ago, I would say even last century. But nowadays, with the organizations I'm working with, the aspects of sexual dangers, we talk about sexual harassment, but sexual dangers or violence is never addressed, or it's really a taboo, knowing also that a lot of mid-class management or bigger bosses frequently are men. So it's there is a discrepancy on how these aspects are treated. So I would be interested to have your comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, when we collected the data into health, so within 3 years, we saw a 25% increase. And I think that's just scratching the surface, to be fair with you, because I think, as mentioned earlier, someone asked a question around how do we make it safer for people to speak out about these things, and particularly culturally, and when people feel really disempowered. And so we could clearly see a 25% increase, and then that matched the statistics for FD consultants in the number of critical incidents. The majority were around sexual violence. So it doesn't surprise me anymore. And actually, when I entered the world of therapy, the number of clients that I had where where their experiences are around sexual violence or childhood sexual abuse. And I even started to question myself, am I just attracting these types of clients, or is this actually happening a hell of a lot more than we think? And unfortunately, it's the second one. This is happening a lot, and I think we're only just scratching the surface of it. Particularly in certain cultures, it would be impossible to talk out about it because you would be penalised, or you might even be thrown in prison if you speak out about it. It can be really horrendous.
Thanks a lot, Fiona. We have another question on the chat feature from Marielle. Does FD consultants also offer services to individuals outside of organizations? For instance, support groups for people experiencing burnout or PTSD?
Sorry, I was reading another question when he said, I was reading that last question. Was that the one? That wasn't the one you just read out, was it? To what extent do you think it's useful to focus on critical instance? No?
No, it was before. Does FD consultants also offer services to individuals outside of organizations? And for instance, support groups for people experiencing burnout or PTSD?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, we support individuals and groups, particularly who suffer burnout and PTSD. Yes. And do you want me to answer that? Sorry, that one I just read. So what extent do you think it's useful to focus on critical instance? Well, I mean, I don't. That was one slide. I think because I talk about vicarious trauma as well as direct impact of trauma, absolutely. And so we can all be impacted from just because we work in the sector, and these are the types of stories that we hear. And we know that stress can lead to burnout, and vicarious trauma can lead to PTSD. But we all have constant low level every day, and particularly now through coronavirus, we're all, as I say, our stress levels are heightened. But what I say when I give when I'm facilitating workshops is actually stress, anxiety and trauma, they are similar. The symptoms are similar. You can do the stress cycle for stress, you can do it for anxiety, you can do it for trauma. There is a slightly different brain patterning that happens with trauma, which causes the flashbacks, the intrusive thoughts. And obviously, when you go through those scales, it becomes much more intensified. So all the resources and all the things that we would talk about how to support yourself can support anyone that's suffering any level of stress, high level or low level stress. Have I covered all the questions? Was there another one there?
There's another one here from Ulrika. On taboo and stigma, there's also the aspect of insecure contractual arrangements, consultants, secondments, etc. So with the fear of not getting a contract renewal or a new posting, issue of stress and feeling mentally unhealthy is not raised by an individual. Is that part of discussions when you, Fiona, work with the management of an organization?
Yeah, absolutely, because that's right. If someone's on a temporary contract, and actually there was one organisation where it was mainly national staff were on the temporary contracts, and of course that's going to increase our stress levels, the sense of uncertainty, and speaking out. And actually speaking out about mental health, the reasons were for being demoted, not getting that promotion, possibly even being put on a performance plan. This is what sometimes people have experienced in organisations, and that's got to change.
Maybe if I could just ask a related but different question. So at one end of the spectrum, there's kind of fear of speaking out. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I think in our sector, there's the like badge of honor. When I first started working and met people who it was this like, well, how many traumatic events have you been in? And how many times has your compound been raided? And how many times have you been through a really nasty checkpoint, et cetera, et cetera. And just from like the interviews and the research that you've done over the years, I'm really interested to hear if you think that trend is changing with perhaps more women being promoted into senior leadership roles. I think the gender balance of this call is really interesting, but whether or not there's a recognition that I think that cowboy culture that was very dominant. Is that changing? And how do you relate with that, with the kind of unique nature of the humanitarian sector?
I think it is changing, but I still think there's a long way to go. So it is changing. And unfortunately, like when I said, most of our referrals initially were when there was a crisis response. And often what I hear when I'm trying to embed these services into organisations is we don't have the funds. But when there's a critical incident, those funds appear. And it's usually from a place of wanting to protect the reputation of the organisation. So again, we've got to rebalance those priorities and invest in the well-being of our staff, and it is changing, but it's chipping away. And I think that's one thing that, because I can get really frustrated and quite angry about this sometimes, and I want to speak out for people that are being treated unfairly or aren't getting the right support and can see that their mental health is being damaged through their work. But I have to keep reminding myself it's about chipping away, because we will be having that ripple impact that will be making a change and making a difference. Even the fact that we're having these conversations, that's making a difference. And there's more and more of these conversations happening. But I've been speaking at conferences in this sector for quite a few years, and the subject keeps coming up. So it is something that can go around in circles, but I try to think of it as a circle that spirals slightly upwards, like a spring each time, and each time we go a layer higher, and eventually we'll get there. But I think COVID and being in a pandemic has had a huge impact as well on the recognition of mental health on staff and having to take that seriously. And I really hope that some of the services that are being embedded into organisations will continue after the pandemic as well, because that will be really important.
Fiona, I'd like to kind of circle back to the beginning. And again, we see that today it's women who participate, and there's a lack of men. And we know that there's more men in management positions, even though there's efforts by some organizations to, right the balance a little bit out. But is that generally your experience, that when you work with organizations that you don't work with men, or what does it need in order to raise the awareness of men to, to connect with this?
Yeah. I mean, we have some good advocates actually that are men. So, but often, like yourself, people that are willing to share their story, and through that they really are passionate about helping others, and as managers will share those vulnerabilities and those struggles. But yeah, probably the majority of people that use the service are female. I think if you have embedded into a system either the regular screening or these kind of pre-deployment resilient consultations, it opens up the eyes for men, because they have to have those. It's part of the system of their deployment, and then they think, oh, this is what it's about, and it's not that scary, and it's okay, and actually I've gained something from this session. And so that can change people's thinking as well. But yeah, it is very telling today. But I mean, peer supporters, it'd be interesting to see how many people sign up female to male. There's one I'm about to roll out early February, but that is 50% men, 50% women. So that's good. Yeah.
All right, good, thank you. Maybe it's time that we kind of draw this to a close. Unless there is any important, urgent statement or question. I would just like to say a couple of words about Co-Create Humanity. I don't know to what extent you know about who we are and what we do. Seb, Helen, and myself, we created an association, incorporated about 1.5 years ago in Geneva. And we all come with a history of traumatic experiences, of invisible injuries, etc. And it has been kind of my vision since I experienced my traumatic experience now nearly 24 well, more than 24 years ago. My idea was always, okay, this should be something positive coming out. And my idea was that maybe we can create something that others don't have to go through the same kind of experience than I did. Now, I realized that security in the field, it's manageable, but you know, sometimes it happens. And as Fiona mentioned, often trauma is exacerbated by the way how management, your employer, etc., deals with you after the fact, after the incident. And that definitely has been my experience for a long time. I had a hard time to find meaning, to step forward, to heal, and that has been. And when it happened, you know, it happened on my initiative and not on my employer's initiative. So this is definitely part of the vision of Co-Create Humanity, and we understand ourselves as a community of peers. So we ourselves, we are not psychologists, we are not you know, we are not here. Our idea is not that we are the specialists to treat you, but our idea is that we would like to provide a community to which you can connect. We would like to be able to offer a bridge to more information. If you're looking for, you know, what to do next, where am I stuck, etc., what kind of opportunities are there, what kind of methods are there. But also we would like to be a bridge to specialists, and information sharing in that context is part of our core purpose. And that's why we have those Humanity topic webinars. And thank you so much, Fiona, today for being here and bringing a different perspective. We have already talked about self-help, we have talked about burnout, we have talked about PTSD. Now, management is, as we can see, is equally as important. We would like to, I know that some of you have already signed up with us, either as associate members or you are on our mailing list. We would like to invite you all to become part of our network. My vision is really to create a global network where humanitarians can always find other humanitarians, where we find somebody who we can talk to, where we find somebody who we know maybe have a similar experience, and can, you know, make contacts within the community. Too often I've realized that when I talk to friends, to family, they don't realize what I'm talking about. And yet community is so important in healing. This basically, you know, we have basically three avenues where we want to work. One of them is creating that community peer support. The second one is providing the information that we can find, the ways, the methods, and all the different richness of experience that's out there. And the third way, obviously, will also be some advocacy, and that will be advocacy with the public, that issues like burnout and trauma is not just being marginalized, but it's also advocacy with employers, with organizations, with agencies, that I hope that one day, you know, this is going to be fully accepted, that okay, this is a risk, but we're going to deal with this, and there is supportive places or supportive cultures there. So you know, I'm a strong advocate for ditching the duty of care in favor of a culture of care.
Yeah.
So okay.
Thanks a lot for that, Christophe. I just wanted to remind you that the webinar is recorded, so you will have access to it via our website, plus the presentation, of course, and some other guidelines if Fiona would like to share with us. So it should be available in a few days. Once again, I would like to thank all of you for being here tonight. Thanks for your trust. And I also would like to announce the next webinars that we will organize. We have one webinar a month. So the next one will take place on the 23rd of February. The topic will be on
transgenerational
trauma and how it affects the work in development and humanitarian aid. And on the 25th of March, we will have another topic on psychological functioning, stress, and hostile environment concept in the humanitarian sector. So of course, we will publish all these webinars on LinkedIn, Facebook, and on our website. And we will also send you a survey after this webinar, just to have your feedback on it. And if you have any topic you would like to raise up for next time, just let us know. We are here for you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks again, and take care, everyone, and see you soon for the next webinar.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Very
you.
interesting.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao. Thank you. Bye-bye.